Welcome everybody to our weekly digital protest that I'm hosting here from Downing Street, 10 Downing Street here in London. These are weekly protests that we're hosting since 6 months now, and we call it Fridays for Freedom. And if you're following this live, you're probably aware of what's going on. But let me recap for those that are joining this time for the first time. Fridays for Freedom is a global protest for democracy and freedom that was started by my organization now 6 months ago. We launched it on the 3rd of July 2020, just 2 days after the implementation of the national security law in Hong Kong, because we believed it was time for people from all over the planet to join the scream for justice, for freedom. That back then, the freedom fighters in Hong Kong were launched with all their strength. And progressively since then, we have joined forces with many other groups from all over the planet. So not only Hong Kong, but Belarus, Venezuela, Russia, Myanmar, many other struggles for freedom that we believe is fundamental for the international community to tackle together, instead of leaving these proud fighters, this proud resistance struggling alone under the rule of authoritarian leaders. So I'm Andrea Venzon, and I'm gonna today give you a quick intro of why we're standing here before giving the mic to a wonderful speaker from the Americas, and I think she's gonna cover in particular the Venezuela struggle, but I won't go into it because it's our little treat for the day. So going back to my point on freedom and democracy, why is it important for people over the planet, also and especially for democratic countries, to keep up this fight for freedom? Because the only hope that we have as a world to see democracy to continue thrive and not continue declining, as it is the case in 2015, is for democracies to come together and protect and innovate the values of freedom that we all respect. How come? Sadly, as you know, as I just mentioned, is now 5-6 years. The democracy index, most democracy index are showing that we are rolling back on essential freedom of speech, freedom of political representation, freedom of simply believing in something that you feel yours. And we are rolling back with authoritarian regimes like China, like Russia, taking more and more space on the world stage and asserting their alternative model compared to the liberal democratic model that we have seen for decades thriving. And I believe there is the role of our generation, is the role of us right now to fight back. And fight back by asserting that the values of freedom, of political freedom, the freedom of speech are so important and so ingrained in what we want to see as a society for us and for our children that we cannot give up. And how can we actually uphold these values in the best way? Apart from, for example, protesting every week to ensure that also those that are right now under the oppression see that they are not forgotten. But how can we do that even better? The solution that we are proposing is the one of actually pushing our governments from democratic countries like the United Kingdom, like Germany, like Canada, like the UK, the US, and so on, to unite, coming together and forming a League of Democracy, a group of countries committed to the protection of democracy worldwide and to the support of freedom struggles in places like Hong Kong, Venezuela, and Belarus, as I mentioned before. And what does it mean in practice? These countries should coordinate sanctions, diplomatic sanctions, and embargo. They should really show to authoritarian leaders and authoritarian regimes that they cannot play with the life of people uh, unless, and if they do so, there would be a very concrete consequences from the free world. So we have started this campaign a few months back, and we are advocating especially for the G7 at the upcoming meeting in June that is going to be here in the United Kingdom, for the G7 to take a strong position on the issue and hopefully to start a motion advocating for the creation of such a League of Democracy. We can start with a small contact group. It can be an intergovernmental organization. It can be anything but it's important that today in 2021, in such a difficult moment for the planet as a whole, a glimpse of light, a glimpse of hope comes and gives some hope to those that are fighting for their own basic rights. And I say that, and I say it in every live, because we have seen 8 years ago what happens when democracy is not protected and when authoritarian leaders are left unchecked. The Second World War happened 8 years ago. And as an Italian, I know that my people, they are now supposedly very in favor of democracy. 8 years ago, forgot about the value and the merits of democracy to follow the first populist leader that was passing by. And this led to huge, huge despair, destruction, sufferings, scars that we still carry on right now, 3 generations later. So if we don't want to see the same happening, if we don't want to see 3 generations from now, our nephews and nieces thinking, how come they didn't act? How come they didn't stand up for freedom when they had the chance? It's time to join Fridays for Freedom or many other activities all over the planet. And especially there is one that is particularly worth mentioning. And with this, I want to introduce our speaker. There is a great work that Amnesty International is doing all over the planet to support freedom fighters, prisoners of conscience, and much more. And with this, I want to give the floor to our guest for today, Caroline from Amnesty Americas, that is going to tell us about what's going on in the region and the struggle for freedom that they are trying to support. Caroline, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, Andrea. And thank you so much to all of you at Fridays for Freedom for inviting Amnesty International, for joining forces to campaign for an end to human rights violations in Venezuela. As you were explaining, unfortunately, authoritarian governments, very repressive governments are increasing, right? Are taking hold of many countries. And that happens to be the case of Venezuela. Amnesty International, for the last 5 years or so, have been documenting cases of grave human rights violations. And like other international mechanisms, like the UN fact-finding mission of Venezuela, we have concluded that crimes against humanity might have been committed in the country. So Venezuela is facing a grave human rights crisis. 5.5 million Venezuelans have had to leave the country. Around 85% of them are in South America. This is the second largest refugee crisis in the world. So we are in a situation where we need solidarity, visibility, and activism to together put an end to this sad and difficult human rights crisis that many, many Venezuelans face nowadays.
Carolina, thank you so much for your message. I don't know if you are continuing the message or do you want me to take on from now?
Yes, I would love, for us to have a dialogue, and especially to ensure that activists around the world can also pose questions, etc.
Absolutely, very, very, very. It's a very good point. Let me ask you something, Carolina. If right now we have people following all over the planet, and this registration, this recording will be shared to our YouTube channel and many others will see. What is the single action that someone that wants to support the struggle for freedom in Venezuela should take?
Could you repeat that question? I'm sorry.
What is
Don't
the
know if in Mexico City.
It's a bit noisy here, sorry. What is the single action that someone that wants to help the fight for freedom in Venezuela should take in their own country? Is there a petition to sign? Is there something they can ask their governments?
Well, throughout the years, we have, learned that campaigning works. No matter how difficult the situation in a country is, no matter how dire it is, campaigning works. So, for example, we have been sadly experiencing major attacks against human rights defenders and humanitarian workers in Venezuela. In early January, 5 humanitarian workers from the NGO Azul Positivo were arbitrarily detained and kept in prison for almost a month. Amnesty International named them prisoners of conscience. Now, they were conditionally released. That means they don't have complete freedom. What can you do in your home country, no matter where you are, where you can online send letters to the Venezuelan government demanding their unconditional freedom? You can write to your own government and demand that your Ministry of Foreign Affairs calls the Venezuelan government and help them to account for all the human rights violations that are being committed. You can ask your own government to support the work of the UN fact-finding mission on Venezuela, which is an extraordinary and independent mechanism document the serious and grave human rights violations in Venezuela. So there are many ways in which you can help. We have an urgent action in the case of the 5 humanitarian workers of Azul Positivo I just mentioned, and you are all welcome to, join us in demanding full freedom for humanitarian workers in Venezuela.
Thank you so much, Carolina. Thank you so much. And I have another question for you, if you don't mind. What's your hope for Venezuela? Obviously, it's been now a long time, many years of difficult situation for those like you and many others that are trying to support human rights, freedom, and democracy in Venezuela. Do you see a light at the end of the tunnel? Do you see some hope coming your way? And if yes, can you tell us a bit more about it?
That's a very good question, Andrea, because as you said, this is a long crisis. The crisis did not start with the pandemic. The crisis started, many years ago. And the truth is that Venezuelans are frustrated, that civil society in Venezuela is constantly under attack, and that also has a toll on human rights defenders. And the society itself is experiencing a humanitarian emergency that has implied that, at least 33% of the population are under food insecurity. So it is exhausting, and years pass by, and unfortunately the crisis has become worse. Yet, of course, we trust that things can get better. I think one major thing that, when you ask for my hope about Venezuela, is to put an end to the humanitarian emergency. Food insecurity and lack of access to health are things that affect people in a very, difficult way. I mean, people going hungry in a country that some years ago was a much more prosperous country is a very grim reality to watch. So we do hope that to mitigate the humanitarian emergency, more humanitarian aid comes into the country. We hope that the World Food Program could soon access the country. It hasn't been able to. We think it's incredibly important that we fight against food insecurity, that we promote access to health, and that the humanitarian emergency can be mitigated. But we also want to see a very major change when it comes to the current policy of repression the Venezuelans face. And I want to make a point around this. When you have a very repressive government, like we do in Venezuela, everyone can be a target. If there is one thing that we have experienced in Venezuela, is that there is not a specific profiles when it comes to being a victim of repression. Journalists, nurses, union leaders, students, members of parliament, you name it, anyone can be a target of repression if the government sees you as a perceived threat or as a perceived dissident. So there needs to be an end to the policy of repression, and we trust that the International Criminal Court will advance its preliminary examination in Venezuela and will be a mechanism to ensure there is justice and accountability and reparation for the thousands of victims of human rights violations.
Thank you, Carolina. And I received a question on social media of someone, and to be fair, as I am, not super familiar about all the geopolitical tensions in the region, in the Americas. And so maybe it would be very interesting if you could tell us a bit more about which leaders in the region are actually supporting the struggle for freedom and which are actually more on the side of Maduro and of the oppressor, if I may call them that way.
Well, the truth is, Andrea, that all governments and all countries face their own human rights challenges.
Yeah.
So even if some, support one leader or the other, the truth is that they all face, their own human rights challenges, and they should be responsible as well. But we do believe the international community has a very important role to play. And if I need to, highlight at least some major actors, I will say the European Union continues to be an important player when it comes to the human rights situation in Venezuela. On the one hand, because of their, political power, you know, um, the UN can act uh, as a, as a group that can within the UN or other international forums can act uh, and can call out and can hold to account the Venezuelan government. But we also feel that the European Union and other, more wealthy countries have an important role to play when it comes to providing international cooperation. As I said earlier, when you have a country that has forced 5.5 million of their citizens to leave their communities of origin, you also have many countries hosting these refugees. And it has become clear that it is very difficult for many South American countries hosting Venezuelan refugees to support these refugees on their own. So we also think the European
I
Union,
think I'm
the
losing you.
United
I
States
can't really
government,
hear
and
you.
others can help support host countries and support the rights of refugees living in their territories.
Carolina, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I hear you well.
I don't know why I couldn't catch the last sentence. If you can repeat it for me.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. I was saying that I believe that, wealthy countries such as the United States, especially now that it has a new administration that has promised to be respectful of human rights, both in the United States but also abroad, and the European Union, among others, uh, should join forces to support Venezuelan refugees living, especially in South American countries, where many governments have publicly said that they need international cooperation in order to support Venezuelan refugees. So we do think, that the international community as a whole has a positive role to play in the Venezuela human rights crisis, and we hope that whatever action they take is a human rights based action.
Very important. Yes, you are completely right, Carolina. And I have a follow-up comment on this. If I remember correctly, uh, recently the ambassador of the European Union was expelled from Venezuela, right?
Correct.
Can
A
you
few
tell us
days ago.
about what happened there?
Well, unfortunately, I think we see over and over again that the Venezuelan government is basically closed to any type of criticism. And the EU, or the UE, I'm sorry, the European Union has always been, or for many years, has been very critical of the Venezuelan government. I think tensions rose. Yes, there were some sanctions that the union imposed on some Venezuelan policymakers, and this led, to these very high tensions between the EU and Venezuela, and the ambassador was declared persona non grata and was given 72 hours to leave the country. Now, our main concern around this is the potential impact this action could have on the delivery of humanitarian aid. As I said, the European Union has been supporting not only humanitarian aid, but humanitarian workers and civil society organizations. And all we can hope is that despite this, regretful action by the Venezuelan government, the EU continues supporting NGOs, continues supporting humanitarian aid, and continues supporting all human rights organizations in the country, because NGOs face attacks, harassment, and criminalization, and they need the support of the international community more than ever.
Thank you. Thank you for this explanation. It was very important because obviously we have a lot of followers from the EU that were wondering what happened exactly. And I just have one last request for you. Do you have a final call to action for our followers? And then I will close the live myself.
Sure. Well, I think, and especially because I know I'm speaking to many, young activists, I think that the more we are, the more difficult it is for repressive governments to silence us. So let's join forces, Fridays for Freedoms, Amnesty International, and many Venezuelan NGOs promote campaigning, promote activism. So find the way through Amnesty International, through Fridays for Freedom, or through other organizations to ensure that you are an activist and that no matter where you are, you can take specific actions, for human rights defenders, for humanitarian workers, and to promote justice mechanisms that will hopefully bring some hope to the victims of human rights violations in Venezuela. Never think that your activism doesn't work. On the contrary, activism works, and the more we are, the more difficult it will be for a government to silence us.
Thank you, Carolina. Thank you for your work with Amnesty International. I want to highlight what you just said. Please, let's get together from all over the planet. So now's followers, Fridays for Freedom followers, remember that Amnesty is doing great work and try to support their work all over the planet. And I want to close this very important live. And once more, thank you, Carolina, for outlining the situation in Venezuela. It is one of the most important struggles for the Americas, for the world. And as you pointed out, sadly, also a long-going struggle. I want to close this live by bringing attention also on a very fresh and sad development. There is the situation in Myanmar. So as you can see, when we talk about freedom, sadly enough, issues are all over the planet. So we covered Hong Kong, we covered Europe, we covered Venezuela, and now we are back in Asia because in Myanmar, as you know, since the 1st of February, protests are going on because the military has brought down the elected government of Myanmar. And while at the beginning the situation was pacific, there is an increase in violence every day. Some governments have finally issued sanctions and placed arms embargo, but only you can count them on the finger of a hand. We need way more from the democratic bloc of this planet. We need way more vocal support, exactly as we need it in Venezuela, as Carolina mentioned. And so I'm here with a small sign, Stand With Myanmar, because I believe that the country, I mean, the United Kingdom, but also the European Union, where I was born, and also all the major democratic countries in this planet can do more to support freedom fighters in Myanmar. In this sense, please at least sanction the military junta that clearly has taken power over a democratically elected government, and this is crystal clear. No one can dispute that. And please ensure also that an arms embargo is put in place because the weapons sold by Europe, by the Americans, are killing innocent protesters. They are just marching in the street to demand freedom. It's not even, there are no riots. It's really about marching and demanding simple freedom. So this shows that, sadly enough, the struggle for freedom is a global struggle, and if we don't act, if we are not timely on these issues, they can go very badly, as is happening in Myanmar, and as sadly is happening in other countries like Venezuela. So I'm here representing an organization, but I hope to represent many more citizens and people over the planet that are convinced, committed, and ready to stand up for freedom in all the right fora. From your local council declaring the support for protesting in Venezuela, to your local government declaring the support to the freedom struggle in Myanmar. Don't give up. Freedom can be protected even in the darkest times. And it's thanks to people like you all over the planet that this is possible. So thank you for following this live. Thank you for joining every week this very important protest. I hope that after COVID, we'll be able to host this protest once more in person all over the planet as we used to do before this fall. But now it's more difficult. So let's stick to the online experience as much as we can. Thank you, Carolina, once more. Thank you, Amnesty, for your great work. And thank you to everyone keeping the flame of freedom alive, even in the darkest moments. Thank you.